My name is Matt Rock. I'm joined by Cliff Embry and Alex Gregor from Winnebago. And let's get into it, guys. So let me kick us off, maybe a little icebreaker here, gents. I want to talk about DLP, about cloud DLP today, but I think it's important that we start by defining the space. So what do we mean by DLP? What does that term mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me. Happy to be here. That's a good question, right? Because DLP is understood as different things by many folks, but for me, it's preventing data from being lost, stolen, or misused. How about you, Alex?
Yeah, we are kind of the same lines as that as well too, is just knowing where our data is and being able to really find our data so we can prevent the misuse of data leaving our environment and being in the wrong hands at the wrong time.
Yeah, right. I would say data security in general, right, is a big part of DLP, and I think that in the industry, we've seen DLP tossed around with things like email security products, right? So like a Symantec, McAfee, Proofpoint, Mimecast, all those guys are all email centric, right? So I do want to kind of shine a spotlight on what about the non-email data stores, Matt?
Yeah. Now, I heard you guys mention a couple of things there, like, what's DLP? You said stuff about prevention. You said stuff about, you know, reaching beyond email. I find myself so often when I talk to clients that DLP is really data loss awareness, you know, and that there isn't a lot of prevention or blocking going on. And so when we think about like how people traditionally approach DLP, why do some of those approaches fail? Why am I valid when I say data loss awareness? Why is no one in the chat telling me that I'm wrong when I use that term? Why do some of these approaches fail?
I guess I can start with that one. It's not knowing where all of our data, where all your data is, I guess, is kind of the biggest thing where you have that DLP or even the awareness. You could have stores out there, you could have configurations that nobody knows about until you start talking to the right people and they go, oh yeah, we have this share stashed here that's located here that only goes off to a couple of people. There's always that hole in somewhere with the whole, I guess, the first wave of looking at DLP and looking at data stores. It's never where you think it is until you really start asking the right questions and knowing the right people to go to find that kind of answer.
It's what's funny is you talked about the wave there, and I think that there are some waves to be ridden when it comes to DLP. But one of the ones that I skipped when we first got started, I was so excited to talk with you guys about cloud DLP. I'd give you a chance to introduce yourselves. So we're going to pause real quick before you guys talk a little bit more about the approaches and how they fail. And Alex, could we start with you maybe a little bit about like what's your background and kind of how'd you wind up in the role that you're in?
Yeah, so my background, I started out as just that lonely help desk user and or help desk support and kind of built my way up and worked through and got into the right places of consulting for 5 years in the Minneapolis area and working with a lot of larger companies that we have in Minneapolis. We are chock full of them. So I got to see a lot of environments and I got to kind of get thrown to the wolves in places. And then joining Winnebago, I'll be here for 3 years, which allowed me to really get my hands in Varonis. But outside of that, I'm kind of like everyone else in security. You don't really have a focus in one spot. I do network security, I do mobile device management, DLP, kind of everything and anything that people ask about is where I get involved. So my background is very broad and I get to do a lot of things. And I think one of the tools, I'll say it because I'm here, but we use Varonis very heavily and it has saved me a ton of time searching and working with the right groups of people. So I will give a big shout out to Varonis for helping us and helping me get things done faster.
Sure. And Cliff, like what about you? What's your background and why do you have a lot to say about DLP?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I was a consultant for a top Microsoft partner for 15 years. So I spent 15 years actually implementing Microsoft technology. So I come, from a Microsoft background, which in the beginning wasn't really security centric, right? It was more Active Directory and management things, right? But moving forward in the 2010s, hopped into Azure and M365 security and never looked back. So I've literally been in hundreds of environments and actually gotten to see how organizations operate.
And I'll be short. I've been riding the wave for data for a long time. And so that's why they let me host these shows and these web forums. Now I want to jump right back into it though, guys, because we're really getting on something there. You guys were starting to talk a little bit about like some of the reasons that things fail. I think I might have heard you mention like false positives. I talked about not blocking. Can you guys talk a little bit more about like let's kind of get back in. Why do some people fail with DLP, or where do things fall short?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, right? And we absolutely did talk about false positives, right? So we get emails and other items blocked from being sent outside of the organization, and it can actually break business processes, right? So that's really one thing that we hear a lot from customers is too many false positives, right? That's really number one, right? But the opposing side of that is going to be not blocking the right data. So sensitive data is actually being exfiltrated out of the environment instead of blocking it. So two opposing, actions that are kind of filling the airways with either too many false positives, too much noise. And I'll follow this up with, and I think a lot of vendors, a lot of organizations don't really realize this piece, but actually the audit trail, right? So what is happening with the data? It's nice to know that you have data. It's nice to know how you're securing that data, but who's touching the data? Who needs the permission to that data, right? That type of information is going to go a long way, because without it, you're not even going to be able to identify and detect anomalies that occur in day-to-day business operations.
And
Yeah,
Alex,
and
anything you want to add there? Go ahead.
I was gonna say I could totally branch off of that too with the audit trail. I think is our biggest thing when we're running all of our audits and not knowing who's accessing that data and when they access it. It's about how much do they really use it and how many times were they in that data, or even downloading and uploading certain data that shouldn't be out there. We've seen it a handful of times. It's especially I will say our C-suites, kind of there's data that's out there that might not be out there in the right places. So we've always seen it kind of come in and out, and that's where we're able to fall back within and say, hey, this needs to be moved or documented the right way. And that's where we can kind of see that audit trail to really get it honed in and worked on to make sure that process is done correctly.
And one thing I see a lot is where like an organization will adopt a DLP strategy, like with Cliff, like kind of like you mentioned earlier, it's like very single focused. They do DLP on email, and that's like the embodiment of their program. Just from your guys' experience, do you see any other techniques like that where the focus of DLP is very, very narrow and very focused? And then B, do you have any alternatives to suggest for that?
Yeah, no, definitely. That was one of the key things I said up front, right? Was that our focus is just on email, and assuming that the egress is only happening from the email service. But when you have tools like M365 and Salesforce, right? Those products are storing data, right? And we need to be able, and they're sharing data. More importantly, they're storing data and they're sharing data, and it's really in the user's hands for better or worse, whether they can share that data, internally, externally, and there's really no regard what is actually in that data from these sharing platforms.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the M365, and even we use Mimecast for our email. It's all about sometimes you only focus on one point, where really there's so much more to it, and it's ever evolving now as well with the cloud environments that you need to have a broader scope to really determine where all that data is, and you got to look outside just the box of one area for DLP and kind of scan and make sure you're covering all fronts when you have your local data stores and you have your cloud data stores and you have your mail. It's making sure everything is not just one point of failure for DLP. You have multiple options to kind of branch from and grow off of.
And you just mentioned, kind of like how some things are different in the cloud and things are different with collaboration. Can you elaborate on that for us a little bit?
Yeah, we have seen it quite quick. We started running with cloud really fast. And I think that's one spot where people don't really realize how much data is out there in a cloud environment until you really start nitpicking everything out there. Looking at just our biggest one is SharePoint. So many active and disabled sites, but yet they're still sitting out there and there's data connected to them. There's users, and OneDrive is another one where people are just right clicking on a file, going share out of your OneDrive, and it's information that shouldn't have been shared through that kind of stream. But our cloud environment and everyone's environment within cloud is evolving so fast. And I think DLP is one of those places where if where it is, it can grow so much quicker with it to help prevent users sharing unwanted document to wrong users.
Yeah. And Cliff, I always hear this story that Office 365, I've heard you say this before, is like a party where the parents aren't home, you know? What does that mean? What do you mean when you tell people that story?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? I mean, think about back into Windows filers, right? So when we're setting NTFS permissions, who's setting those permissions? It's the admin, right? The admin has the utmost control of your NTFS permissions. You shift to the cloud, you shift to M365, a platform built for collaboration, right? And now the users are able to share that data directly to either the entire org. They can share to anyone on the internet. They can share to specific people that are outside of the org, external users, guest users. I mean, there are SharePoint groups, there are M365 groups, there are permissions all over the place. And for the most part, users have had their way with these tools because I don't think a lot of organizations have had a handle on how to control these. And in some cases, there is no native control for some of these actions. Like, how do you get a handle on permissions in an environment?
Yeah. Now,
Sorry,
go
I
ahead.
was going to cut in. It's
Please,
even
please.
the sharing of data too. Is you could have shared someone from 3 months ago that might still have access to documentation. And now in that SharePoint location, you've thrown in new files, and now that user from 3 months can see that information, that brand new information they're not supposed to see. And I think that's where the cloud, like you said, party with no parents is it gets out of hand real fast when you don't realize permission base. And in the cloud, it can be so fluid and so fast that people are missing that kind of change in those security standards around them.
And now, when we were catching up earlier today, kind of talking about the data first forum today, the other thing you mentioned was around interconnectivity. How does interconnectivity make DLP different in cloud?
The way that information is being stored, I think, can be huge with the interconnectivity. If we have our local data stores that are out there exposed, then we don't really realize that information that we're putting in there, or that information, like mentioned, was shared to certain groups. It's kind of watching the lines and making sure what we're building off of is kind of all going through the same process.
And one of the areas where we see companies suffer from data breaches and we get called in after the fact to investigate them is where they don't even realize how apps are connected. And I'll give you guys a couple examples, and maybe Cliff will take the bait on one of them. So, like with Snowflake that just happened a couple weeks ago, Snowflake got targeted by a threat actor for credential stuffing, reusing creds without multi-factor authentication. People were able to access a lot of information. But another thing that happened to companies is if their Snowflake, like maybe a service account that acts as a connector, was a part of that compromise, that connector has access to way more than just Snowflake. And so, hackers were able to use that for lateral movement. And I think in the cloud, it's a lot easier to have these unexpected interconnectivity risks between applications. And I know, now we're mainly talking about DLP here today, Cliff. So when I say Copilot, don't get too excited. But I know that this is like something to do with the graph and graph connectors. Like, how does that play a role with DLP as well?
Yeah, I mean, we can use that as the example. In fact, I watched a very nice RSA keynote that talks about graph connectors, right? And how so basically the graph looks at M365, right? unless you plug in connectors, which you can plug in Salesforce, and GitHub, and Jira, and on-prem file repositories, right? So you can actually use these, these AI tools that are supposed to help surface data more easily, right? And it can actually connect to these other repositories outside of M365 in this case, right? It could be Snowflake, for instance, right? We could be connecting to Salesforce, but that is a big, a big deal here, because a lot of the security, when these are implemented, when these other repositories are connected to things like M365, are usually not set up properly, right? And they give everyone in the organization access to these repositories because that was the easy thing to do when we implemented it. That kind of sets the stage for a lot of things, right? It was easy when we implemented it, but now we have to come back and take a closer look and actually peel back those permissions and right size them.
And what I've heard you guys say a lot so far, and we'll talk more about like what good DLP looks like in a second, but what I've heard you guys say a lot so far is that this traditional mindset of like DLP as being a single place to do blocking isn't enough, right? Like, and Cliff, you mentioned something like there might be places where that's not even an option, where there is no solution to go in line or in a cost effective way to actually to block something. So you can do stuff like, I think I heard you say access control. Alex, you mentioned something about visibility. I want you guys to expand on that. What are good DLP outcomes? If someone's joined this session today and they're thinking, I need a DLP project, what are some of the outcomes that they should be after, and why are those important?
Yeah, I'll start off there, Alex, and just say that for me, detecting and preventing sensitive information from being shared with unauthorized users, right? That's really what what I'm looking for mostly. Is I want to make sure that data is not getting into the right hands. But there's a lot of pieces that go into that. So maybe Alex, you can tell us a little bit about how the outcomes that you guys are getting over at Winnebago would be something nice to hear from you.
Yeah, we've done I guess our successful wins is being the customizing of labeling information and going and building off of that. We're a manufacturing company. We have a lot of patents that are out there that shouldn't be shown or shared. So if we're able to, like we can, retain that kind of information internal and keep it, that's a huge win for us on the DLP side. And that's something we've been pushing to and building off of to kind of keep that information internal, to make sure we're not kind of going out and saying, here you go, here's new information before anyone is seeing this. Let's just kind of lock it down and keep it in. And even with we have 6 different entities within Winnebago. It's making sure the data that's actually transferring between business to business is being guarded the right way. We're knowing exactly, hey, only this stuff is supposed to stay internal, or hey, this stuff we can go to business and share the right way. And that's been our biggest win with DLP, is we know the data is going to the right sources. We're building in the right areas, and we're working as a team. We have a lot of our whole environment is kind of untrusted between each other, and that's where we're able to work with each other within our, I should say untrusted is kind of our AD environment. So we're able to have the links in between to work with each other and build to make sure our data is going properly. And we're able to say, this needs to be done, and this is how we're going to work off of it. So we've been building quickly, I would say the least, and it's changing to where we need to even do more to kind of get to those points of driving it home and working with users to make sure everything is kind of in that same level set, and we're all on the same page with how this data and information should be moved.
And I just want to go. Sorry, go ahead, Cliff.
Oh, I was just going to, you mentioned, Alex, that, visibility was key here, right? That we need to see what we have in order to enforce anything. And I think a secondary piece of that is business continuity, right? So now we can see everything, right? That's number one, most important. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but from a business continuity perspective, how did you guys go about doing that without actually breaking the business?
We had to do a lot of team sessions to kind of communicate the right pieces of what we were looking for. We went through our security team to build that first level. And then from there, we were able to communicate it out to the other business units to say, hey, we're going to work as a team. This is the information we need. These are all the places we need to know this information and learn to work better to expand out on our visibility. So we're capturing everything. And if there's a file server, a local file server that's changing, to communicate it to us so that we can keep up with everything that we know that's ever evolving internally, but then knowing what is working outside of our scope as well to work with other teams as well to keep us all on the same level front.
I just want to try to say some things back to you guys and give me a thumbs up if I'm nailing it, okay? So I heard, Cliff, first thing you mentioned was like, got to be able to stop bad sharing, because someone overshares something, like, got to be able to stop that, undo that. I heard you guys, Alex, you really mentioned you got to make sure you make it like really accountable to your business and protect like trade secrets, intellectual property, but also enable, whether it's business to business or sub business, kind of like sub company to sub company, but enable people to collaborate. Like, we can't pull away the ability to share information. So it's kind of sharing with control. And then you both mentioned visibility, I think 10 times. Like, you both said, like, you got to know where the stuff is, who's accessing it, who has access to it. But when we think about like, this classic view of DLP, why isn't that enough? Like, why isn't DLP alone enough to prevent the loss of data?
Well, I think because a lot of times when we're leveraging DLP, we are looking for little bits of information, right? We're looking for a credit card number. We're looking for a social security number. And that's not always enough to fire a DLP rule or prevent one from firing if that's not really a social security number. So I think the classification, right, is huge. I think we have a little snippet where we're going to talk a little bit more about classification, but access, if you have visibility, you can actually determine where you need to change your access controls, number one. So that's going to actually pare back those permissions to the data, right? So what about the data that users need to have permission to? That's where you're looking at those single item classifications. I'm looking for credit card numbers, or I'm looking for, social security numbers. And then the DLP will interpret that and either potentially block it, right? Either true positive, false positive is really what we're going to get out of that. And the way to make that work better, any DLP, any third-party DLP, is going to be labeling your data, right? So labeling your sensitive, critical, most important data. It's not something you want to do environment, wide on every, you don't want to encrypt every document in your environment. That doesn't make sense. That's why you need the visibility. So you can determine where you need to apply these labels, right? We're talking sensitivity labels with Microsoft, right? And when you use those, third-party DLPs can interpret that label. So we've taken all of our pre-work that we're doing in the front end to classify data, and we're applying a label to the document. So now Purview and Mimecast and Proofpoint and all these tools can now say, hey, I have a confidential label. Let me take the appropriate action here.
And I would even branch off that too with saying you have the DLP, you have the labeling, but it also comes down to user training. And I think that's something that can help eliminate so much mishandling of information. Is you set the standard, you work with each business unit, and then you kind of you reciprocate that out to the users to say, hey, we can go, you can label it, you can label it, and then we suggest what it should be, or we can automatically label it. And that's, I think the biggest thing with DLP is just working with users, helping prevent, again, and I'll keep saying this, is just the misuse of information. And it really comes down to, as everyone sees, it's users. It's our frontline support. It's all those people that see it right away. Is if we're going to roll out classification, it's working with them to say, hey, this is how we need to proceed forward and kind of build from there.
And I want to launch a poll really quick and then ask one of the questions from our audience. So you guys have all used the term labeling. I also hear people use the term tagging. So let's give our audience a chance to see if anybody can spot the difference. And then, Cliff, maybe you can explain the difference between the two of those. But one of the questions that came in, again, while we give our audience a chance to answer that, was And maybe Alex, I'll ask you this one first. Someone wanted to understand, like, well, how do you actually build out your labels? And I heard you mention, answer this already. Do you do manual labeling, automatic labeling, or a mix of them? Can you talk to us about how, what your organization took to build out their labels and kind of like what that means from a business context, and also whether or not you use automated or manual labeling?
Yeah, our biggest thing when we started looking at labeling was going through our security team to really define the labels, the informational, the confidential restriction, what forth from there. But then it's also proceeding to our legal team to verify with them their kind of thoughts. Is this something that's the right way? And once we went from there, we kind of started to roll it out to we wanted to do it first with the manual labeling. We didn't want to take it all from them right away and just say, "Hey, I'm sorry, this is what it is." Because then you, like Cliff mentioned, you get the lockdown information. Now users can't do anything with that information when it could have been misclassified or it could have been mislabeled. There could have been kind of that sticking point where now if we've worked through to do manual labeling, it helps us on our back end to really understand what users are looking for and kind of how they're also defining what we've presented to them. And it's not just saying, okay, here you go, you label it, it's good to go. We're looking at it on the back end to make sure it's all done. And kind of we're growing as a team as a more secure environment to help each other, not just help us in security, because we already know we have enough going on in security that if we're able to help the users and train the users, we can build to make a better, more secure environment.
And Cliff, can you tackle that poll question for us? So what, like,
Yeah.
tagging versus labeling, what's the difference? Seems like 66% of people think it's that second one.
And that is 100% correct, right? When we talk about tagging, we're really talking about the classification of the data, right? So it's actually the central representation of what we have there, in the data. So the classified data, whereas the label it travels with the document. So it's decentralized. It's a single point, access control, if you will, if you're using encryption. Otherwise, it's just a label like built into the header of the document. But it sticks to the data. It travels with the data. And sometimes people get these terms mixed up in terminology, and it can cause some confusion. Just as long as whether you're saying tagging or classification, that's great. But when we're talking about labeling, that is something different altogether.
Yeah, and our people in the chat are real worked up about this topic. There is a lot of people that want to talk to you guys about classification and labeling, so we're going to need to sit here and expand on this for a couple minutes. And I think to get it started, though, I want to launch our next poll, which has to deal with asking our audience, how many labels does your organization have? I'm really, really curious about this, and I won't change everyone's answers. So let's give everybody about a minute or 30 seconds to answer us here, whether you got 4 labels, 8 labels, 12 labels, somewhere in between there, or more than 12. If you've got 5, just choose the next one. Choose the next one up. We're real curious to see, kind of what the average amount of labelings is an option. And if you have 4 or less, select 4. Martin, for that one, I'm so excited to see that there's people out there wanting us to say 4 or less. And Cliff, I really like what you said. Tagging is sort of like this representation. Hey, like this thing is tagged as sensitive because there's sensitive stuff inside of it. But a label, it really like travels with that file or object wherever it goes. It's persistent. It's something that is attached to it, even if it leaves the container that it's in. So let's see. I'm really curious if our hosts can maybe share out our poll results. It seems like a lot of people don't have too many labels, which is something that I was hoping for. As it just a personal anecdote, I meet with hundreds of Varonis customers each year, and the more labels I find an organization has, the higher the likelihood they're going to fail in some way, shape, or form. Because if you get too many labels, it's difficult for your users to understand it. If you branch too far outside of those labels, then people don't know the use cases where they belong. Before I came to Varonis, I worked at a law firm. We made things really simple. I think much like Eric, who just put it in the chat. Eric, I'm going to read that out loud. Public internal, confidential, and restricted. That was exactly the labels that we used. And because it really things can ultimately be boiled down to that, like what is meant for just the company and just your organization, and it sounds like David Brown had the exact same thing. It seems like a lot of people have this four label option. So I want to ask you guys, our panelists, it seems like people are in the right mindset on how many labels to have. But could you talk to us about what happens when labels are wrong or missing?
I could start with that totally.
Yeah.
With mergers and acquisitions, yes, we build off of four, but when you get into new environments, you see that all of a sudden it's they have four, but they're titled different and they've been trained different on different words. And next thing you know, you're on eight, and then you get another choir, and then you're on 12, and you keep going up on that four level every time. That was kind of our biggest thing we saw, and that was our biggest user training was, hey, these are the four, and let's build from there and kind of get everyone on that same level set. Let's not have 12, because then you get the mislabeling and you get the misinformation, and next thing you know, somebody changes companies and they stay within the Winnebago entity, but then they go from one to another. Now their labeling is completely different, and you have that mislabeling information. So we've seen it a couple of times, and we've had to work with a few business units to really get that footing and to say, hey, this is where we're building. Let's proceed from there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and go ahead, Cliff. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we no name calling a customer, right? I have worked with in the past, right? Accidentally labeled 10 million files. And that takes 15 months to do, right? So someone went in and turned on a policy and it rolled through the environment. Now, luckily, they weren't encrypting data with this label. And I think it was actually a confidential label. So the headache was basically they were seeing confidential everywhere all over their environment. But I think I just bring that up to point out that just one, slip of a policy and some lack of attentiveness, and 15 months later, you've got 10 million files that will take you 15 months to undo.
Yeah, and I want to just pause this for a second, guys, because again, our audience really wants to engage with us on this topic. And so we've gotten a bunch of questions that come in. One, I'm going to give to you first, Cliff. Can you give us an example of tags? Labels are commonly known, internal, confidential, public, restricted, but like what are tags? Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah. So when we're thinking when I hear tags, right, that's really to me synonymous with the classification, right? So the classification being, oh, this is PII, right, or GDPR or CCPA or what. Tagging and classification are synonymous to me. So HIPAA, PII, GDPR, CCPA, those are the classifications, right? The actual tagging that we're laying down for the data, right? So those are the same. Classification and tagging aren't the same to me.
Okay, and Alex, you talked a little bit about manual labeling and automated labeling. Could you expand on that? And I'll give you a couple of questions that have come in from the chat to get you to understand why I'm asking you that. One person said, do you mean users are tasked with manual labeling? How do they cope with this overhead? And then another person asked, do you perform your labeling in an automated or manual way or a mix? Can you just talk about like what the kind of like a practical approach that your organization uses for the mix between those two?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, we do the manual labeling. It's something that like I mentioned, we're trained our users and worked with them to really get to the point of you need to manually label this. But then we also have within Varonis, we can do the process of they can manually label it, but then we can also go through the kind of the hybrid, I guess, of it to say, hey, we can also suggest this is labeled. So if they don't label it, we're able to come back through and put a certain label on it to really make
Or
sure.
if they label it low, do you label it up for
Yep,
them?
we
Yeah.
can kind of give the right mind to it to kind of help it, so it's not something with, oh, here's all of our payroll information. They labeled it as low when really it should have been something that was high because there's so much information with this. So we're able to work with users in that hybrid kind of the hand in hand. We allow them to manual, but then we also can override with the suggested, I should say, not the override, but the suggested help of what this document should be.
And Cliff, one came in I want to throw at you. How do we gracefully, keyword there, manage sharing medium and high confidentiality data? External sharing from SharePoint doesn't seem like the right approach. We find ourselves dropping a document's classification and label down so that it can be shared, which defeats the purpose of having the label in the first place.
Yeah, no, this is so I did want to address this because there was something else that came up in the chat that said you can't do DLP right if you only have 4 labels in X industries, right? Because they are highly regulated. And I just like to first back up and say you need like the number of labels. Sure, I think keeping it simple is important, right? But when you're looking at just say your classification, your data governance plan or whatever you have that dictates what your classification should be in your organization, public, internal, what was it, restricted and sensitive, yeah. I think is what we were using. Well, so if you go adding encryption, right, to documents via a label, and you try to share this data, right, by sending an email to a person, remember the protection and the label travels with the document. So in order for that user to be able to open it, they have to be on the access list. If they're outside of the organization, right, or outside of the specified group that's on the access list for the label, they can't open it, right? So you're downgrading it to perform your job function. And the answer to your question is, if I, excuse me, if I need business continuity, if I need a way to get a job done, right? So we may have, one label for, say, sensitive, right? Like say sensitive PII, right? Where the data is encrypted with the label. But a lot of times, and Microsoft will recommend this as well, if you go look at their deployment acceleration guide, that you actually have a label that removes the encryption so that it can remain the same classification in the label structure, right? But you take away the encryption so the person can actually read it when you send it. Now, that doesn't protect your data. That allows your business continuity, though, your business process to complete. However, what you really need to do is take a step back and look at how you're sharing that data, right? Is there a way to make that user come to you, to come into your SharePoint environment where you can put restrictions in place that don't allow them to download it, right, to their PC? There are all kinds of controls that we can put in place if we're bringing them to us in our SharePoint environment, making them a guest user and the tenant. Now we got conditional access. We got all these tools at our disposal, right?
And I'd like to back up. So we're all talking about solving this with labeling. And what I often find organizations miss a big elephant in the room here is, knowing and having this inventory of your data. Step one, got to do it. To be able to do labeling, to be able to control sharing, you got to do it. But I see a lot of organizations jump straight to labeling and digital rights management and forget about access control. You can examine all the sharing that you're currently doing without labels, with or without labels, and determine is this appropriate sharing? And so when you can't use digital rights management and labeling to enforce controls on a document because you have to collaborate with someone, you need to have collaboration with control. Right? This is what we talked about earlier. And so what I would encourage people to do is just try not to mesh all this into one conversation. Visibility, step one. Access control, monitoring, step two. Labeling, digital rights management, encryption, step three. These are phases of a security maturity journey. It's not all about having everything on every file. I think of a lot of it akin to NIST or ISO, where we have these libraries of controls, or CMMC, where we have these libraries of controls that based on risk, we have to select and implement. You need to look at your data the same way. We need to apply the appropriate level of controls, whether it's visibility, access control and monitoring, or labeling and digital rights management, based on the risk and the value of that data. I also heard someone say, and either one of you guys can answer this. And maybe we're gonna make S. David Brown feel like they're adding a lot to the chat here. But they said one way to look at the difference between confidential and restricted is based on the amount of damage it would cause your company if it got out. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. There's so much information that it could just be one person to accidentally release something that could totally flip our being publicly traded. That information can change everything on a company, and it's making sure that you are kind of building off the right areas. Like David said, with the confidential, it's huge to know what is really worded in that document and how that document is going. But there's so much change to it that can, yes, damage a company quite quickly if that information was released.
Sure. Two more questions I want to throw at you. First one's for Cliff, second one's for Alex. Cliff, what if you got legal requirements that says you can't change the integrity of the file? What do you do?
Access control, right? I mean, that's your point, Matt. Is I think people are trying to solve the problem with labeling, and I think, and then just to be 100% transparent here, I love Microsoft, right? Microsoft has
I
gave
hope
me
you love Varonis too, Cliff,
I
but that's
do.
oh,
I do.
yeah.
I do love Varonis, but Microsoft, me working in Microsoft products has given me my livelihood, right? But you can't get everything right. And saying you need to label all of your data to protect it is only because there's no means to fix the underlying permissions.
And so, like, what you're saying is that there are going to be situations and circumstances where you just can't put a label on a file, and you need to do access control and monitoring in those places. Does that kind of make sense? All right, Alex, next one's for you. Okay. And that is, how do you manage the review of people who down label stuff? What do you do with the down labels?
Yeah, we have automation policies set into place that we've gone through manually created to really kind of, I wouldn't say nitpick, but to know what's really happening within our environments. We want to see that. We want to see the information if it does get changed in its labeling. We have process and policies within Varonis that we've created to know how we're building, how that data is, if it is changed, who did it, and we kind of go to them and say, hey, why was this data changed? We're able to get notified on that ticket basis, and then we can kind of work with the user to say, hey, let's do this right the next time, and kind of really learn how we should be proceeding forward with this information and what's built within to provide that better environment.
Okay. So I'd like us to launch our final poll. In this final poll, we're really just looking for your feedback from the audience. And while that poll is up, I'm going to comb through with our marketing hosts to make sure we didn't miss any questions that people had come up in the chat. And then once we get through that, we're going to give you guys just like a place to start, kind of like I'll give you my personal get healthy DLP prescription, as someone might say, and we'll let Cliff and Alex add on to that, and then we'll bid you adieu. So just for starters, thanks so much, fellow surfers, or those riding the wave of cloud and DSPM and cloud DLP and all that stuff. And thanks, Cliff and Alex, for being here. When I think about like a get well plan for someone with their DLP, first thing I would tell them is, one, like, you got to get visibility and you got to figure out like what you're working with. What I mean by that is you're going to have sensitive data in different containers in different places, cloud, on-prem, somewhere in between, even endpoints. You got to figure out, where is that stuff? Where are the high concentrations of sensitive data? And you got to, from classification, you got to classify everywhere. You got to figure that out. Then you got to start thinking about access control and monitoring, because no matter what else happens, no matter if you got agents on your phones and computers, or as Cliff said, in your emails, you're not going to be able to make sure that between every place where a person can share data, that you have some type of blocking mechanism. So you need to focus on these large containers, these large warehouses where you store data, and make sure it's locked down. And then you can start thinking about things like labels, and having all that visibility can make sure that you do that in a way that doesn't bake business processes. So, you can right size those permissions, you can label your data, you can feed those labels to DLP policies. Am I on the right track here, Cliff and Alex? Anything you guys would add to this, or any kind of final tips you want to give to all of our viewers?
I would say, and I think we could throw out the word out there, don't do it all in one big wave. Make sure you're rolling it out in different phases, because if you do it all at once, you're going to get the users that they're going to shut down. They're not going to do the right processes. They're going to kind of be like, this is way too much. We're done with this. And then next thing you know it, nobody's labeling anything. It's just out there. Nobody's kind of providing you the right information anymore, because you threw so much at them at once. You kind of hit them like a tsunami, and it just, you wiped everything away, and now you're kind of working backwards when it should have been a forward process the whole time. But doing it in smaller waves is I would say the best way to kind of build up your DLP program. Don't crush everyone at once. It's going to be a long road.
So as Ashley would say from the beginning, right? Get in the lineup, ride one wave at a time.
Yep.
Don't wipe out. I like it, Alex. I like it. I like it. Cliff, anything you want to add, and if you don't throw a surfing pun in, I don't know if we're going to have you back on another day.
I don't know. That's a lot of pressure right there. But I will say that I totally agree with Alex on the labeling front. Like I like to say, you got to incubate before you're born, right? Then you can crawl and walk and run, right? You can't just push out labels and encryptate all over the place. That doesn't work. But what you can do immediately is get that visibility, right? It doesn't hurt anything to get the visibility and classify your data. The end users do not see that. Then you can determine where you want to peel back permissions and label data.
And we got a really special offer for anybody here on the session today, and that is you can get that visibility totally for free from Varonis in a risk assessment. So if you didn't click yes, feel free to drop your information in the chat and we can have someone reach out to you. We would love to help you get started on this journey. Or if you're already on this journey, maybe you're doing labeling. Maybe you're doing some of the stuff that Cliff and Alex suggested you don't do. Another reason to get an assessment. Okay, you can reach out to us. If you didn't click yes on the Q&A, no worries. You can put your message in the chat or even just go to our website and request a data risk assessment. That's how we start any customer that we work with on this journey. It's always with an assessment to figure out where they are and to get recommendations from us. Even if you don't move forward and purchase Varonis, which we hope you do, you'll be able to get a tremendous amount of value from knowing where your sensitive data is, where it's exposed, and where you might be making some of the mistakes that we talked about on the session today. So with that, I just want to ask everybody to thank Cliff, thank Alex for joining us, and thank you so much for being here on another Data First Forum.